So, looking forward to this conversation with you, Chad Aldeman. Just want to give you a little background on why I want to talk to you today. Missouri just wrapped up its legislative session late May. This is the second year in a row that we have tried to make some inroads into what I consider to be a crisis, which is that 42% of our fourth graders are below basic in reading. And we have tried to force the state education agency, which is called the Department of Elementary Secondary Ed, to improve how reading is taught, to create a system of basically uh, guardrails around kids progressing with being promoted without knowing how to read, all of which have failed. What does it mean for a fourth grader to be below basic in reading? Because given that more than 4 in 10 Missouri fourth graders scored below basic, what does that mean?
Yeah, you can find the questions that kids are struggling with, but below basic is a very low level, and it means that kids cannot read an unfamiliar passage and understand what it means. And so in fourth grade, maybe you're not super worried about the kids, but you probably should be because that is a key milestone. So if you're not reading in fourth grade, you're really going to struggle with everything that comes next. You're not going to be able to understand social studies and science. You may not be able to read owner's manuals or instruction manuals when you're trying to build things at your house. You're really going to be dependent on other people interpreting words and language for you. And, you know, YouTube's helpful. Lots of things are helpful, but we're still in a written culture and there's lots of information that's written that if you can't pass even the basic level, you're going to struggle with in life going forward.
Yeah, so this is kind of the problem, which I consider to be basically a crisis. 42% of our kids are below basic. What we call it when we're trying to fix it goes like early reading, early literacy, um, read to learn. It goes by a bunch of different names. But when my kids were little, so like 30 years ago, I think it was called whole language, which is this like language rich environment that kids would just learn to read. But now there's a thing called three queuing. What is three queuing? I assume it means that kids are supposed to look three different places for cues. But what specifically is three queuing?
Three queuing and whole language have a lot of similarities. They're basically trying to get people to memorize the words. And so rather than sound out like my name is Chad, it's pretty phonetic. So rather than understanding that the combination makes the ch sound, they want you to just memorize the picture in your head of what word is. And really good readers have a lot of memorized words. Like I don't have to sound out my name. There are lots of words that I go to that my brain just goes like that because I'm so familiar with it. But that's taking that of what expert readers can do and then trying to use that as a method to teach kids is actually really harmful. Kids develop those skills by learning the core elements. And so the CH combination makes the ch sound. They need to practice that when they're learning to read. And then over time, they'll just see that and recognize it really quick. And English is quirky. English is not entirely phonetic. It's still quite phonetic, and phonetic basic is still the building block of reading. There are other things when the ch doesn't make the ch sound, when it makes the hard c like k, and so kids need to understand and recognize those as well, and they need repetitions for that, and they need to understand what is the normal rule, what are some of the exceptions, and so forth going forward too.
So would three queuing be considered to be part of the science of reading or not part of the science of reading?
Three queuing is not part of the science of reading. So three queuing is saying rather than teaching kids the building blocks of the language, it's having them guess at the words based on either a picture that they see. So there's a picture of a horse, and so they see a word that may be it, and they just guess horse. And the text may actually say pony, and sometimes that those differences actually do matter a lot. So picture, the second cue is the first letter of the word, and so recognizing the letter or other context clues. So if it's a story about horses, then maybe you might guess horse. And those cues can are detrimental to actually learning how to read, of knowing the what the words and the letters actually translate into.
Why? Why is it detrimental?
Because it leads into guessing, and so it might be harmless for a 4-year-old to, uh, say pony or horse when the words actually say the opposite. But as kids get older and they start reading more complex texts, those types of mistakes really do matter. And if you haven't learned the phonetic skills, you're not going to be able to read a word like ribonucleic acid or something like that. When you start reading more complex words, all of a sudden you can't break them down. Your mind doesn't have that ability to sort of understand how to break down a word that you're not as familiar with.
So, 2 years in a row at least, if not more, the legislature has tried to ban 3 queuing so that, um, teachers would not be allowed to use it. They punted a little bit and said that it can't be the first thing they use, but could still be a tool in their toolbox. They've gotten a lot of pushback, like many states in Missouri, legislators are sometimes former teachers, sometimes they're married to a teacher, sometimes their best friend is a teacher. There's a lot of, um permeation there of teachers, and they have said that Missouri, this is our throwback all the time and it drives me nuts. they'll just they'll just say, you know what, we're a local control state, so we can't tell these teachers what to do, and when they're there the moment in the classroom they know best, and that's how we roll in Missouri. But what I hear you saying is it can actually be harmful.
Yeah, and so you asked about the science of reading, and this is a big term, but there actually is a science about how kids learn to read, and it's been well documented for a long time over empirical researchers looking at whether kids do better under method A or method B. And what they found is that teaching kids the building blocks of learning to read, like I was talking about the phonetics, is more helpful, particularly for students who might struggle or are dyslexic or have other language issues. Um, and so if you teach the 3 queuing strategies, you're teaching them the wrong thing and you're leading them down the side road. It can lead to bad habit formation, which is then really hard to kick later on. Um, the other thing that I think is relevant to bring in here is that um, math is fully sequential as a subject, but reading is also somewhat sequential, and kids need a lot of practice in the early grades in order to be proficient readers. And if you use the 3 queuing tactics, you will be not giving them the blocks that they need to develop. And uh, it's a challenge to get kids back on track if they're off. And so um, there's all kinds of data about delays in reading, and kids who aren't proficient by 3rd grade will struggle in in the longer term, the short term. And so it's really important to catch those issues as early as possible in K2.
Well, on that note, another component to the legislation that's been considered and that we have been supportive of is if a child at 3rd grade or 4th grade has demonstrated that they are substantially behind in learning to read, they should not be promoted to the next grade. What do you think about that policy?
Yeah, some people might hear that policy and think it's punitive and it's going to be bad
Mean.
for kids, but it's not about 3rd grade. It's not what happens at the end of 3rd grade. I see that policy as more of a threat to the adults in that student's life about making sure that doesn't happen. So in K through 2, those students are being flagged and identified as being at risk of being potentially held back, and they're given interventions and supports so that they're ready to take it and pass it in 3rd grade. And that's really my read of the evidence of the research of lots of kids who might be flagged as having reading in the states that have these types of policies. Kids who are flagged as needing more help get the help. And that is the key, is this sort of threat of being held back and then the interventions and all the adult behaviors it changes. So teachers then know which kids need extra help. They then communicate to parents about, hey, your student, your child is behind and they need to catch up. And here's what we're going to do to help them. I wrote about this in Mississippi, and they have learning plans, specific, tailored, individualized instructional plans for those children who are at risk of being held back. And parents are brought into the conversation of here's one, it's pretty scary that your child may be at risk of being held back. And so here's what we're going to do in the interim to get them ready for that. And that is the key for me. It's not the what happens in third grade, it's all the stuff that happens before and what the adults can do to make sure kids are ready.
Yeah, because if I understand it correctly, Mississippi has that policy, but they don't actually retain that many kids.
Yeah, that's right. And so in state after state, the states that have these types of policies, the number of kids who are ultimately retained are not that high. There are screens that are identified earlier on K to 2, and then interventions that are put in place. And um, oftentimes there's some exceptions for students with severe disabilities or English learners who are newly arrived. Um, and chances for retakes if there's something about stress on the day, or they go through a summer program. There's other ways to get students ready. It's not just the third grade cut point.
Yeah, it seems like it's one of those situations, and I doubt it's unique to Missouri, where people in charge of this area of life of teaching young children to read feel threatened, or they feel like they're being criticized because we have a real problem with uh, really 40 some percent of our kids being almost illiterate, and they are taking it kind of personally, the adults, and therefore they're resistant to any policy that would force the hand of these districts or teachers. And to me, that's just a shame, right?
Yes, I agree. I think part of it goes to the culture a little bit in education of every teacher is supposed to create their own idea and method for how to teach. And so we don't really give teachers the building blocks of here's a well scripted curriculum. And if you follow this, your kids are likely to be successful. And uh, some of the highest performing schools and school districts and countries do a much better job of being clear that here's a well-defined, articulated curriculum, and we're going to support teachers to do it. And there's still the how and how it gets implemented, but the what is pretty well articulated of um, and this goes back to the science of reading idea of there is a science. It is evolving in the sense that there's still more science being conducted and we're still learning new things, but we know a fair amount about how kids learn to read. And so teachers and schools and teacher preparation programs should be equipping their teachers to use those things.
So you have spent a lot of time studying this and writing about this stuff, and you decided to take a leap and just start your own company?
Yes. So I got interested in this because my own child was taught to read using three queuing. And he came home during the pandemic, and I was oblivious. I kind of thought my son could read. We had been to school and celebrated his reading superpowers that the
Yeah.
teachers in the school had taught. And they were things like guessing of the pictures, picture power. Um, and so during the pandemic, he was a kindergartner and he came home and we sent him up to his room to do silent independent reading. It turns out he was just guessing and he hadn't been taught how to sound out words. And so after working with him, I came up with this program called Read Not Guess. It's a program that it's designed for parents to work with their kids, both to build early literacy building blocks of the phonetic skills, and then also as a way that they can spot any early reading issues with their own children as well. So it gives parents the tools to work with their kids and then also support them from home and to be an advocate by their side as well too.
And your son was in what's considered to be one of the top school districts in the
Yeah,
country? Fairfax County, Virginia? I mean,
yeah.
it's
Fairfax County public schools. No
yeah,
people move here for the schools, and yet we were
sure.
using a balanced literacy three queuing approach to teaching reading. To the district's credit, partly because the state forced them to change. They have now changed to a more of a phonetics based approach, and they're using something called they're building content knowledge. So they've adopted a curriculum that's also trying to build students' content knowledge along the way, which is all I'm supportive of. I'm sure there are people within the districts who are upset, but the state said, "This is what we're gonna do," and so they've moved in that direction.
You're certainly not anti-teacher. You've been working on teacher stuff for as long as I can remember, right?
No, very pro teacher. I
Yeah, right?
uh, pro good policy. I'm pro helping kids learn to read, and I think that's one of the basic things that schools can do,
Yeah.
and that they should be doing.
Yeah, yeah. It really is frustrating to me that when something's not going well in our state, we have a 520 school districts. They're not county based like Virginia's. We have 520, and the just to me starts to feel like a throwaway line to say, "Oh well, we're local control." As a matter of fact, somebody in our state education agency, the Department of Elementary Secondary Education, said out loud in a recorded meeting, like, "It's not our fault the kids can't read. We're local control." And I think as everyone sort of passes the buck and no one takes any responsibility for it, and some of them actively work against retaining third graders who can't read, banning 3Qing. And the last thing that we were looking for was just that every student in the state would take essentially the same test with the same cutoff score so we could know consistently across districts which students, like you said, are at that at risk group so we could identify them early. Got pushback on all of it. And it's baffling to me. We're not trying to be mean to teachers. We're trying to help little kids because I see it ultimately impacting the Missouri workforce and everything else. I mean, we are graduating kids from high school who cannot really read.
Yeah, there's a reason that the state created an education system in the first place, and the
Sure.
districts are entities of the state, and there are state standards, and so they should be teaching kids to those standards, and reading is a big essential building block of that. And so, yeah, I think there's, how far they get down into curricular choices is something that people can still debate, but the ultimate goal of teaching kids to read, and here are some methods that have been fundamentally disproven that we should, as a state, abandon, I think is a good argument, valid argument to make.
Well, Mississippi seemed to lead the way with this, made the Mississippi Miracle, and then we have Louisiana and some other states. Do you see that? Do you see this spreading nationwide? This idea of forcing schools to use the science of reading?
Yeah, more states have science of reading laws writ large, and they vary in the components of what they do. Last I saw, it was 42 states. So Missouri is one of the last stragglers to not have one of these
Right.
laws. And the laws vary across the state, across the country, of how strict they are in terms of what the state's going to do versus what they're putting on districts, in terms of the third grade retention policy versus the state mandates on curriculum, if they're giving the districts a menu of options, or they're just saying can't use three queuing. Um, and there's also other things about, like, screening, what happens for students with K2, how much parents are notified, and sort of what they're given to do to help their children. So all those things are variable, but I think the most interesting point for Missouri is that most states have now adopted one, and they're pushing in this direction because they see the crisis, as you've articulated, and the urgency for it. There's still some important implementation logistics to get right if Missouri wants to see strong outcomes. I think being focused on third grade reading is very important. Building it into accountability systems, building it into everything the state does, trying to simplify that and keeping it a priority. If the state is saying, we don't really care if it happens, then you're not going to get outcomes. But if you focus on it and think about ways to drive it, then there are levers that can be used.
Yeah, well, I hope we do it. Read Not Guess. Where do folks find out more about that?
Yeah, so Read Not Guess is a website. It's an email-based program. Parents can sign up for free at any time.
Free, right?
It is free, yeah. So there's 3 levels, starting out with a beginner level, level 1, and there's level 2 and level 3. They all are 30-day sequences. So parents, when they sign up, receive a sequence of 30 emails for each of the levels. I also have one for slightly older kids who just need more practice, called a dailyish decodable program. There's an app version of that program as well, or I
That's
have a
awesome.
workbook now that's available if parents want it in print form as well.
Well, that's great. Way to like try to jump in and solve the problem yourself. I appreciate that. Well,
Yeah,
thanks so much,
that's
Chad. So always great to talk to you. This was kind of narrow. We might need to have you come back and talk about school finance a little bit. That's another sticky one in Missouri, and a little bit about teacher pipelines, but I'm just going to reserve you for early literacy today. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Let's chat.